The linen veil lifted from Nefret's face just as the first grain of sand struck her eye. She stood beneath the ceremonial canopy, her hand outstretched toward Kenti's, the merchant's son she'd been promised to since childhood, when the wind changed. It came from the west, that cursed direction, carrying with it a sound like the breathing of Set himself. The wedding guests, 24 families from their village of Perbast, fell silent. Even the sistrum players stopped mid-shake, their bronze rattles hanging uselessly in the suddenly heavy air. "The gods speak," muttered old Peneb, the village elder, his sun-weathered face draining of color beneath his white ceremonial wig. "They speak, and we have not listened." Nefret's father, Amos, stepped forward, his best linen kilt already darkening with the sweat of fear. "Continue the ceremony, quickly now. The priest, where is the priest?" But Father Meremptah had dropped to his knees, his leopard skin cloak pooling around him, his eyes fixed on the western horizon. When Nefret followed his gaze, her breath caught in her throat like a fish in a net. The sky was eating itself. A wall of sand rose from the desert, taller than the great pylons of Thebes that her father had described from his youth. It moved like a living thing, churning and roaring, blotting out the afternoon sun until the world turned the color of old blood. Above it, lightning crackled, impossible lightning in a cloudless sky, purple and green like the bruises on a corpse. "The Devourer," the priest whispered, and several women screamed. "The prophecy, Sekhmet's wrath made manifest." Kenti grabbed Nefret's wrist, his fingers digging into her copper bracelet. "What prophecy? What is he talking about?" But Nefret knew. Every child in Perbast knew the story they were forbidden to speak of, how their village had been built on the ruins of an older settlement, one that had angered the lion-headed goddess for stealing from her temple, how every generation the debt remained unpaid, how one day the goddess would send a storm to collect what was owed. The wind hit like a physical blow. The wedding canopy tore free from its poles, the painted linen whipping away into the churning darkness. Nefret's carefully braided hair, woven with golden thread and jasmine flowers, came loose. Sand filled her mouth, her nose, her ears. Through the chaos, she heard her mother shrieking her name, heard the wedding oxen bellowing in terror, heard the grinding crash as someone's mud-brick house began to collapse. And then she heard something else. A voice, low and ancient, speaking words in a tongue she shouldn't understand but somehow did. "One life freely given, or all lives taken. Choose, daughter of Thebes, choose now." The storm reached the village, and the world became darkness and screaming sand. The underground grain storage saved them. Nefret found herself crushed against the cool limestone wall, her wedding dress torn and filthy, surrounded by the desperate press of bodies. Her father had somehow herded half the village down the narrow stairs into the chambers where they kept the barley and emmer wheat for lean seasons. The air was thick with grain dust and terror, lit only by 2 sputtering oil lamps that cast wild shadows across faces she'd known her entire life. "Everyone accounted for?" Amos's voice was steady, though his hands shook as he counted heads. Nefret watched him with new eyes. Her father, who managed a village granary, who'd always seemed so solid and unremarkable. Now she noticed how his gaze kept sliding toward the priest, how the 2 men exchanged looks heavy with unspoken meaning. 12 missing, Peneb reported grimly, caught outside when it hit. Bakari, the potter, the family from the northern quarter, young Sanu who was watching the goats. Nefret's mother, Mutnofret, let out a sharp sob and pulled her younger brother Anan close. The boy was only 8,
his face streaked with tears and sand. Above them, the storm raged with sounds that shouldn't come from any natural wind. Wailing, howling, sometimes almost forming words. Kenti appeared at Nefret's side, offering her a cup of water from the storage jars. "Are you hurt?" "No." She took the cup with trembling hands, noticed how the water rippled from the vibrations of the storm above. "Your family?" "My father and brothers made it. Mother and sisters went to the temple earlier to make offerings." He paused, face pale in the lamplight. "If the temple still stands." The temple. Nefret's stomach clenched. Per Bast's modest shrine to Bastet sat at the village's heart, but it was built atop older foundations. Foundations that, according to whispered legends, once belonged to Sekhmet's temple, before the village's founders had dismantled it, selling the carved stones to buy land rights from a corrupt district official. "Father Merentah," she called out, pulling away from Kenti. The priest sat apart from the others, his leopard skin draped over his shoulders, despite the underground chamber's warmth. "What did you mean? The Devourer? The prophecy?" The chamber fell silent, except for the storm's muffled roar. All eyes turned to the priest, whose weathered face seemed to age another decade in the flickering lamplight. "Tell them," Amos said quietly. "They have a right to know why they might die today." Merentah drew a long breath, his chest rattling. 143 years ago, when this village was founded, 17 families came from the north, fleeing famine. They found an abandoned temple here, Sekhmet's temple, built when this region still served the warrior goddess. The temple was intact, its treasures untouched. Gold, jewels, sacred oils worth enough to buy a small kingdom. "They stole from a goddess?" someone whispered, horrified. "They told themselves the temple was abandoned, that the goddess had moved on." The priest's laugh was bitter. "They used Sekhmet's gold to purchase these lands, they broke apart her altar to build their houses, they melted her sacred vessels to make wedding bracelets and plow tips, and," his eyes found Nefret, "beautiful jewelry for their daughters." Nefret's hand flew to her throat, to the golden collar necklace her father had given her this morning, her wedding gift. The metal suddenly felt hot against her skin, branded with stolen prayers. "The goddess cursed them," Merentah continued, "said that in the 7th generation she would return to claim what was owed, that a storm would come on a day of false joy, and only the payment of a life freely given in atonement would spare the village." "The 7th generation," Peneb said slowly. "That would be—" "Now," almost finished. "Our children. The 7th since the founding." Above them, something massive crashed against the ground, shaking dust from the ceiling. Anan whimpered. Nefret looked around at the frightened faces, at the children clutching their parents, at Kenti standing rigid beside her. "One life freely given, or all lives taken." "There must be another way," she said. We could make new offerings, rebuild the temple. We're not responsible for what our ancestors—" "The goddess doesn't want our offerings." Merentah's voice was flat, final. "She wants justice. She wants balance. A life for the desecration. Freely given, or she'll take everyone." In the awful silence that followed, Nefret heard the voice, again. Wind carried, even through stone. "Choose, daughter of thieves. The sun sets on your people."
Kenti's hand found hers in the darkness, and Nefret was struck by how warm his fingers felt, alive, solid, real. They'd played together as children, splashing in the irrigation canals while their parents worked the fields. She'd helped him set his first broken bone when he fell from a date palm at 12. He'd taught her to read merchants' tallies so she could help her father with the granary accounts. Their marriage had always been assumed, as natural as the Nile's flood. Now she wondered if they'd have a future at all. How long can we stay down here? Someone asked. It was Sekhmet, the weaver, her baby clutched to her chest. We have water, grain. We could wait it out. Wait out a goddess's wrath? Peneb shook his head. This storm won't end until Sekhmet has what she wants. It could rage for days, weeks, until we suffocate down here or die of thirst when the water runs out. Then we fight, said Nebamun, Kenti's father, his merchant's mind already calculating odds. We gather what we can, make a run for the river, get to the next village, find help. There is no next village by then, the priest interrupted. Look at me, Nebamun. You know I served in the army before I took my vows. I've seen sandstorms, natural ones. They howl for an hour, maybe two, then pass. This, he gestured upward, this is divine fury. The sand will scour the flesh from your bones before you take 10 steps. The wind will pull the breath from your lungs. You'll be dead before you reach the village edge. Nefret's mother began to weep, a hopeless, broken sound. Almost put his arm around her, but his eyes were on Nefret. She saw something in them she'd never seen before. Guilt, grief, and beneath it all, a terrible resignation. Father? Her voice came out small, childlike. Father, what is it? He opened his mouth, closed it. Finally, the necklace. The one I gave you. Do you know where the gold came from? She touched it again. That suddenly horrible weight around her throat. You said it was your grandmother's. Yes, and my grandfather made it from something his mother gave him, passed down through the generations, reshaped and reworked, but always from the same source. The goddess's collar, from her statue in the original temple. We've been wearing her divinity as decoration. The horror of it swept through Nefret like cold water. She looked around the chamber, seeing it now. The golden rings on fingers, the copper bracelets, the silver amulets, all of it, every piece of metal wealth Père Beset possessed, made from stolen sacred objects. The village's prosperity built on blasphemy. We were supposed to make restitution, Almost continued. Every generation swore they would, but every generation found reasons not to. The children needed feeding, the irrigation channels needed repair. There was always something more urgent than appeasing a goddess who seemed to have forgotten us. We thought we'd escaped the curse, that the 7th generation would come and go and nothing would happen. We were fools. Nefret's mind raced. Somewhere above them, 12 of their people were already dead, probably buried under collapsed houses or lost in the killing wind. If they did nothing, everyone in this chamber would follow, 53 souls. Her parents, Onan, Kenti, the babies who'd never learned to walk, the elders who'd survived wars and famines only to be claimed by divine vengeance. One life freely given. It should be one of the elders, Peneb said slowly, voicing what no one else dared. Someone who's lived a full life. I have 72 years, no wife anymore, my children grown. I could... No, Marantop's voice was sharp. Freely given, the prophecy says. That means choice, real choice, not sacrifice born of shame or duty or age. The goddess demands someone choose death with a clear heart, accept it willingly, or she'll know the offering is false. Then we're all dead, Nebamun said flatly. Who chooses death willingly? What sane person? I will. The words left Nefret's mouth before she fully realized she'd spoken them. The chamber froze. Every eye turned to her, and in the lamplight their faces showed shock, horror, disbelief. No. Kenti's grip on her hand tightened painfully. Nefret, no! You can't, you don't mean... But she did. The moment she'd spoken, a strange clarity had filled her, cold and bright as the moon. She looked at her brother's tear-stained face, her mother's devastation, her father's guilty anguish, saw the potter's apprentice barely 16, who had his whole life ahead of him, saw Sekhmet's baby, innocent of any crime except being born to this cursed place. I'm the bride, she said quietly,
The wedding, that's what she chose. The moment of joy to be turned to ashes. She took my wedding. She wants my life. She met the priest's eyes. Am I wrong? The priest stared at her for a long moment, then slowly shook his head.
They tried to stop her. Kenty grabbed her arm, his face wild with panic. This is insane. You're not thinking clearly. The storm, the fear, it's clouding your judgment. We'll find another way. There is no other way. Nefret gently pulled free, though it cost her more than he could know. Kenty, listen to me. If I don't do this, everyone dies. Your little sisters, your mother at the temple, everyone. Then let me go instead, his voice cracked. I'm your husband, or I was supposed to be. Let me protect you. Let me. It has to be her, Merimta said softly. The 7th-generation daughter of the line that committed the theft. Amos, your grandfather was Sinib, yes? First son of Meru, who led the original 17 families? Amos nodded mutely, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. The Nefret is direct descent. The curse names her. The priest turned to Nefret with something almost like respect in his ancient eyes. But child, understand, the goddess will not make this easy. The path to the temple ruins is exposed. The storm will tear at you every step. You must walk into the heart of Sekhmet's fury and offer yourself at the place where the desecration began. If your will falters, if you try to turn back, she'll know, and we'll all die anyway. I won't falter. Nefret surprised herself how steady her voice sounded. Inside she was screaming, but she couldn't let them see it, couldn't let her mother's sobbing break her resolve, or Anand's desperate, "Don't go, sister, please don't go," shatter her determination. Her father approached, moving like an old man though he was barely 40. From his neck, he removed his own amulet, a small golden wadjet, the Eye of Horus, meant to provide protection. Take this. It was my father's. I know it's made from stolen gold, but maybe it will guide you. Nefret accepted it, closing her fist around the warm metal. Tell me the way, the exact path. Straight through the village center, past the well, toward the northern quarter. The old temple foundations are beneath what we call the meeting ground. There's a stone there, flat and circular, carved with lioness heads. That's where the altar stood. That's where you... He couldn't finish. She nodded, turned to her mother, who clutched Anand and wept too hard to speak, to Kenty, whose face had gone blank with grief, to the dozens of people watching her prepare to die for them. If this works, she said, don't ever forget. Don't let the next generation forget. Don't steal from the gods. We won't, Almost whispered. On my life, on all our lives, never again. The stairs up were steep, carved from limestone that felt ancient beneath Nefret's sandaled feet. Each step took her closer to the roaring chaos above, away from the relative safety below. Merimta climbed behind her, insisting that someone witness her sacrifice, that the goddess be shown proper respect in Parabast's final moments. At the top, the wooden door strained against its frame, buckling inward from the wind's pressure. Sand seeped through every crack, creating small dunes on the upper steps. The temperature dropped the higher they climbed, and Nefret realized the storm had blocked out the sun entirely. It would be like walking into night, into the void, into death itself. "Are you afraid?" asked the priest. "Terrified," she admitted, "but more afraid of what happens if I don't go." That's wisdom. He placed a weathered hand on her shoulder. The gods honor courage, child. Even when they demand terrible things, they honor those who face them bravely. Sekhmet is the goddess of war, but also of healing. Perhaps your sacrifice will heal more than just this village. Nefret didn't answer. She gripped her father's amulet in one hand, placed the other on the door, drew a breath that might be one of her last. "When I open this," Merimta said, "run. Don't hesitate. Don't look back. The wind will try to knock you down. The sand will blind you. Keep moving north. If the gods are merciful, you'll reach the altar stone before the storm kills me." She managed a bitter smile. He said nothing, only began to pull back the wooden bolt securing the door. The wind hit like a battering ram the moment the seal broke.
Nefret had thought she understood storms. She lived through the annual haboobs that swept in from the western desert, coating everything in fine red dust. She'd endured the rare autumn gales that tore palm fronds from trees and sent market awnings flying through the streets. She'd even weathered the terrible come-sin of her 8th year, when hot wind blew for 3 days and 2 people died of heat stroke. This was nothing like those storms. This was divine fury made manifest, and it wanted her dead. The wind struck her the instant she crossed the threshold, hitting with such force she stumbled sideways into what remained of old Kaimwaset's house. The mud brick wall had collapsed, leaving only the wooden door frame standing like a skeleton. Sand filled the air so thickly she couldn't see her own hands, could barely breathe without inhaling grit that scraped her throat raw. Above the wind's roar, she heard laughter. Low, dark, feline laughter that came from everywhere and nowhere. Sekhmet's voice or her imagination? It didn't matter. Both were equally terrifying. She pushed forward, one arm raised to shield her face, the other clutching her father's amulet like a lifeline. The wedding dress that had been white linen this morning was already torn to rags, strips of fabric whipping away into the darkness. Sand scoured her exposed skin, each brain a tiny blade carving away everything soft. North, she thought desperately. The altar stone lies north. But which way was north in this howling chaos? The sky was the color of blood mixed with ash. No sun, no shadows, no landmarks. The village she'd known since birth had become an alien landscape of destruction. Houses reduced to rubble, the irrigation channel filled with sand. Bodies. Gods, there were bodies. Partially buried, their forms twisted in final agony. She stepped over someone's hand reaching from a collapsed wall and swallowed her scream. Keep moving or everyone dies. The wind changed direction, and suddenly she could see a few paces ahead. There, the community well, its stone rim somehow still intact. That meant she was near the village center. She was going the right way. She pushed toward it, using the last of her strength to reach the well's shelter, and found she wasn't alone. Huddled against the far side of the well was a figure, small, child-sized, curled into a ball. For a heart-stopping moment, Nefret thought it was Anan, that her brother had somehow followed her. Then the figure raised its head, and she saw it was Sinu, the young goat herder, one of the 12 who'd been caught outside. "Help!" he wheezed. His face was a mask of blood and sand, his left arm bent at an unnatural angle. "Help me, please!" Nefret's heart clenched. She'd known Sinu since he was born. His mother had died in childbirth, and his father had taught him the herder's trade before succumbing to fever 2 years ago. The boy was alone in the world, orphaned and struggling, but always kind, always gentle with his animals. He was 11 years old. She dropped to her knees beside him, checking his injuries with practiced hands. The broken arm, yes, cracked ribs, cuts everywhere, deep and bleeding. But he was alive. Against all odds, he'd survived the initial storm and found shelter. "Can you walk?" she shouted over the wind. "I don't know. I tried, but..." He gestured weakly at his legs, and she saw one ankle was badly swollen. The altar stone was close now, maybe 50 paces through the storm. She could see the meeting ground ahead, see where the sand had been scoured away to reveal ancient stone foundations. So close. But if she left Sinu here, he'd die. Exposure, blood loss, the storm's fury. Something would claim him before this ended. One life, freely given. Was this part of the test? To see if she'd choose one life over many? To see if her sacrifice was truly selfless, or if she'd abandon another to save herself even seconds more of existence? "Hold on to me," she said, making her choice. She hauled the boy up with her good arm around his waist, taking his weight. He was light. Too light, she thought distantly, all his herder's muscles wasted from 2 years of barely adequate food. Together, they stumbled forward into the storm. Every step was agony. The wind tore at them, trying to rip them apart. The sand flayed exposed skin. Twice Nefret's feet went out from under her, and only Sinu's desperate grip on her torn dress kept her from falling. Once, lightning cracked so close she smelled burning ozone and felt her hair stand on end. But she kept moving. The meeting ground emerged from the chaos like an island from fog. There, in the center, exactly as Peneb had described, a flat, circular stone, 3 paces across, carved with lioness heads around its circumference. In its center, a bowl-shaped depression, stained dark with something that might have been ancient blood. The altar stone, ground zero of Per Bast's original sin. Nefret dragged Sinu onto the stone and collapsed beside him. The boy was unconscious now, his breathing shallow. She could leave him here, she realized. Complete her sacrifice. Let the goddess decide if one was enough. But she'd already made her choice when she stopped to help him. "Sekhmet," she shouted into the storm, her voice raw and breaking. "Great goddess, lady of slaughter, hear me." The wind died. Not gradually, instantly. One moment, chaos. The next, absolute stillness. The sand that had been airborne fell like rain, coating everything in sudden silence. In the eerie calm, she could hear her own ragged breathing, Sinu's labored gasps, and something else. Footsteps. She looked up.
The woman who emerged from the settling sand was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. She stood 7 feet tall, draped in linen so white it hurt to look at, with skin that seemed to shift between human bronze and golden lioness fur, depending on the angle of the light. Her face was angular, fierce, with eyes that glowed like embers. Around her neck hung a collar of gold and carnelian, matching the one Nefret still wore. The same collar, Nefret realized, with cold certainty, that her ancestors had stolen and reforged. Sekhmet, the goddess herself, wearing flesh to walk among mortals. Nefret tried to prostrate herself, but her battered body wouldn't cooperate. She managed to drop her head, to press her forehead against the ancient stone. Beside her, Sinu remained unconscious, mercilessly unaware that he lay at a goddess's feet. "Look at me, daughter of thieves." The voice was layered, multiple tones speaking in harmony. Nefret raised her head, meeting those burning eyes. Up close, she could see that the goddess's pupils were slitted like a cat's, that her fingers ended in claws instead of nails. "You came," Sekhmet said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, lady. Through the storm I sent to destroy you, past bodies of your people, knowing you walked toward certain death." The goddess circled the altar stone slowly, her movements inhumanly graceful. "Why?" "To save my village, to pay the debt," Nefret's voice cracked, "to make right what my ancestors made wrong." And yet, Sekhmet stopped, gesturing at Sinu's crumpled form. You delayed your sacrifice, risked failing to reach the altar in time for one boy, one life, when I demanded yours specifically. Nefret swallowed. I couldn't leave him. Whatever I am, whatever my ancestors were, I'm not someone who can step over a dying child to save myself seconds more of breathing. Even though saving him might doom everyone you love, even then. The goddess studied her for a long moment, those ember eyes unreadable. Then, shockingly, she laughed, a sound like distant thunder. You understand nothing, child, nothing of the gods or justice or the nature of sacrifice. Then teach me, Nefret said, with more boldness than she felt. Before you kill me, at least let me understand what I die for. Sekhmet moved closer, until Nefret could feel the heat radiating from her divine form. When she spoke, her voice was quieter, almost sad.
Your ancestors stole from my temple, yes, desecrated my altar, profaned my sacred objects. But that crime was theirs, not yours. You were not yet born. The guilt does not transfer. Nefret blinked, confused. But the curse, the prophecy, you said the 7th generation. I said nothing. The goddess's words were sharp. The curse came from our own people. Guilt and fear passed down through generations like your stolen gold. They convinced themselves I demanded blood, that only sacrifice would appease me. They created their own doom through belief. The world tilted. Nefret grasped for understanding. The storm is mine. Yes, I sent it. Sekhmet's claws traced the lioness heads carved into the altar stone. But not as vengeance, as a test. I wanted to see what 7 generations of guilt had created. Would your people finally make restitution? Would they take responsibility? Or would they simply let fear consume them? I don't understand, whispered Nefret. The priest was wrong about many things, the goddess said, but right about one. I demanded a life freely given, not as payment, as proof. Proof that the people of Per Bast had learned something beyond greed, that they valued each other more than gold, that they could produce someone willing to die for their community. She reached down, her clawed hand surprisingly gentle as she tilted Nefret's chin up. You proved it, child, and more. You proved that even in your final moments, facing certain death, you would not abandon compassion, would not sacrifice your humanity to buy yourself more time. Tears tracked through the sand on Nefret's face. So, I failed? Because I stopped for Senu? Failed? Sekhmet's laugh was warmer now, almost affectionate. Foolish girl, you passed. The test was never about dying. It was about living with honor, even when death seemed certain. The goddess stepped back, her form already becoming translucent, bleeding back into the natural world. Then she paused. Oh, and child, the boy beside you, he lives because you chose to save him. Remember that. Remember that the gods honor those who honor life, even at the edge of death. She vanished.
The aftermath was chaos of a different kind. The chaos of survival, of reunion, of counting blessings and mourning losses. 12 had died when the storm struck, their bodies found buried in collapsed buildings or partially mummified by the scouring sand. The village gathered them for proper burial, weeping, but grateful the toll hadn't been higher. The irrigation channels were filled with sand that would take weeks to clear. Half the houses needed repair. The fields were damaged, the stored grain contaminated with dust and debris. But they were alive. Nefret spent the first day after the storm in a daze, accepting tearful embraces from her parents, from her brother, from people she barely knew who kept thanking her for their lives. Kenti stayed close, his hand constantly finding hers, as if he feared she might still disappear. Senu recovered slowly, his broken bones set by the village healer, his cuts cleaned and bandaged. When he finally woke fully 3 days after the storm, Nefret was sitting beside him. "You carried me," he said, his young voice wondering, "through the storm. I remember pieces. You could have left me." "No," Nefret said simply. "I couldn't." The boy studied her face, then nodded as if she'd answered a much deeper question. "My goats are gone, lost in the storm. I don't know what I'll do now." "You'll help me rebuild the temple," she said. "If you want. We'll need many hands, and the goddess said it should be built from honest work. Your work is as honest as anyone's." He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him in years. The village council met on the 5th day. Peneb, recovering from injuries sustained in the crush to reach the granary, called for an accounting. The stolen gold was gathered, every piece of jewelry, every amulet, every copper pot and bronze tool that could be traced to the original theft. It made an impressive pile in the center of the meeting ground, glinting in the sun. "We melt it all down," Ahmos declared. His guilt had aged him, carved new lines into his face, but there was also a kind of peace there that Nefret had never seen before. "Every bit. We use it as the foundation for the goddess's new temple, the first stones blessed with returned gold." "And the temple itself?" Neberman asked. "We have little wealth left for such a project." "We have time," Nefret said. "Sekhmet didn't demand speed. She demanded sincerity. We build it properly, even if it takes years. We teach our children why we build it. We make sure no one forgets." The council agreed unanimously. Father Marantop died that night, peacefully in his sleep, his duties fulfilled. They buried him with honor, placing in his tomb a small golden lioness figure, one of the last pieces to be melted down, saved as a final gift to the priest who'd guided them through darkness. 2 weeks after the storm, when the village had established a new routine of recovery and rebuilding, Kenti found Nefret at the altar stone. She visited it daily now, cleaning away sand, studying the ancient carvings, trying to understand what the original temple had looked like. "Do you still want to marry me?" he asked without preamble. Nefret looked up, startled. In the chaos, she'd almost forgotten. They'd been interrupted mid-ceremony, their wedding literally blown apart by divine intervention. "Do you still want to marry someone who walks into storms and argues with goddesses?" "Especially someone who does that." He sat beside her on the ancient stone, taking her hand. His merchant's hands, she thought. Soft compared to a farmer's, but strong in their own way. "I thought, after everything, you might want different things now. You spoke with a goddess. You saved the village. You're not the same person who stood beside me under that wedding canopy." She considered this. He was right. She had changed. The girl who'd spent her life worrying about properly braided hair and keeping her father's granary record straight felt like someone from another lifetime. She'd touched divinity and survived. She'd chosen death and been reborn into purpose. But when she looked at Kenti, at his familiar face, his honest eyes, his patient presence through 2 weeks of madness, she felt something solid, something worth keeping. "I'm not the same," she agreed, "but I still want to marry you, if you'll help me build the temple. if you'll understand that I have a duty now beyond being someone's wife. I'll help, he said, and I've always known you were meant for more than just managing my household accounts. They were married a month later, in a quiet ceremony at dawn, on the altar stone itself. No canopy this time, no elaborate decorations, just family, close friends, and the village priest who'd replaced Merentah, a young woman from the next village, who'd trained at the temple in Memphis and understood both old and new ways. As she spoke the binding words, Nefret looked up and thought she saw, just for an instant, a lioness watching from the village edge. Golden eyes met hers, and she felt the goddess's approval, like warm sun on her face. Then it was gone, and there was only Kenti, her husband, and the long work ahead. The temple took 7 years to build. They did it properly, with stones quarried honestly, with gold refined from the original theft, with carvings done by craftsmen who understood they were creating something sacred. Nefret oversaw every detail, learning architecture and theology, becoming both priestess and builder. Sinu grew into a young man beside her, discovering a talent for stone carving that transformed the temple's walls into stories. On the day of the dedication, the entire village gathered. Nefret's children, 2 daughters and a son, ran between the temple pillars, laughing. Anin, now 15, practiced the prayers he'd written for the ceremony. Her parents, graying but proud, held hands and watched their daughter light the sacred flame. And Nefret thought about that day 7 years ago when she'd walked into a storm believing she'd die, about the lessons Sekhmet had taught her, that sometimes the gods don't want blood. Sometimes they want better people. Purbast never forgot. The story was told and retold, carved into the temple walls where Nefret's figure stood forever at the altar stone, arms raised, not in sacrifice, but in defiance. The village prospered, known throughout the region as the place where a girl had faced a goddess and earned her blessing. But Nefret's favorite part of the story came years later, when she was old and her grandchildren played in the temple courtyard. They would ask her what it felt like, that moment when Sekhmet appeared, and she would always answer the same way. I was terrified, but I learned that the gods honor those who honor life. Remember that. Remember that fear is not the opposite of courage, it's the beginning of it. The temple stood for 300 years until Egypt itself changed and new gods came to claim the land. But that's a different story. This one ends here, with a wedding postponed by a storm and a village that learned that the price of prosperity is responsibility. And with a girl who became a woman, who became a legend, who proved that sometimes the best way to survive a storm is to walk straight into its heart.